The German shepherd's howl cut through the morning air like a blade through silk, raw and desperate, in a way that made Detective Sarah Chen's blood run cold. She'd heard that sound before, 18 months ago, in a warehouse that still haunted her dreams. But Rex wasn't supposed to be here. Rex was supposed to be dead. The funeral procession had stopped. 200 police officers, their dress blues pristine against the October sky, turned as one toward the sound. The honor guard froze mid-step, the American flag draped over Phil Robertson's casket, rippling in the sudden silence. Someone's radio crackled with nervous chatter, but Sarah couldn't make out the words over the thunder of her own heartbeat. Rex stood at the cemetery's edge, 70 pounds of muscle and memory, his dark eyes locked on the casket. His coat was matted, scarred along the left flank where the bullets had found him, where they'd all thought the bullets had killed him. The dog's chest rose and fell in rapid pants, and Sarah could see the slight tremor in his hind legs. The same tremor Phil used to massage away during their quiet moments in the precinct. "Jesus Christ," whispered Captain Martinez, his voice barely audible. "That's impossible." But Sarah knew better than most that impossible was just another word for things they didn't understand yet. She'd learned that lesson in Blood and Gunpowder, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, in the moment when everything she thought she knew about loyalty and betrayal got turned inside out. The dog took a step forward, then another. His movement was deliberate, purposeful, like he was following some invisible command only he could hear. The mourners parted without thinking, creating a pathway lined with black shoes and tear-stained faces. Sarah felt her hand drift toward her service weapon, not because she feared the dog, but because she feared what his presence meant. Rex had been Phil's partner for 7 years. 7 years of drug busts and domestic calls, of late nights and early mornings, of the kind of unspoken communication that made them legendary in the precinct. When Rex had taken 3 bullets in that warehouse, bullets meant for Phil, it had broken something in the veteran detective that never quite healed. Phil had carried Rex's bloodied collar in his breast pocket every day since the shooting. Even now, 18 months later, Sarah could see the faded leather poking out from beneath the flag. The dog stopped 10 feet from the casket, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something none of them could hear. His tail, usually high, hand alert, hung low but steady, not defeated, waiting. Sir Officer Davidson's voice cracked as he addressed the captain. "Should we—" "Nobody moves." Martinez cut him off. His own voice carried the weight of 30 years on the force, but Sarah heard the uncertainty underneath. They all did, because this wasn't just about a dog showing up at his handler's funeral. This was about Rex choosing this moment, this place, after 18 months of being presumed dead. This was about the way the morning light caught the scars on his fur, creating patterns that looked almost like symbols. This was about how every cop present felt the same chill running down their spine, the same feeling they got when a case was about to crack wide open. Sarah's mind raced back to that night in the warehouse. The tip had come in anonymous, a major drug operation, enough product to put half the dealers in the city away for life. Phil and Rex had gone in first, standard, protocol. Sarah was supposed to be backup, 30 seconds behind them. 30 seconds that might as well have been 30 years. She'd heard the shots before she'd seen the muzzle flashes. 4 quick pops, then Rex's agonized yelp, then silence. By the time she'd burst through the warehouse door, Phil was on his knees beside his partner, pressing his hands against wounds that pumped blood like dark flowers blooming in the dim light. The shooters were gone. The drugs were gone. Rex was dying. "Stay with me, boy," Phil had whispered, his voice breaking. "Just stay with me." But Rex hadn't stayed. The veterinarian had done everything possible, but the internal bleeding was too severe. They'd said he'd died peacefully, with Phil's hand on his head, whispering promises about chasing rabbits in heaven and never having to work another late shift. Except Rex was here, alive, scarred but breathing, his intelligent eyes fixed on the casket like he was trying to will it open through sheer force of devotion. The priest, Father McKenna, cleared his throat softly. He'd performed dozens of police funerals, had blessed the caskets of officers who'd died in the line of duty, but Sarah could see this was different. Even a man of God could recognize a miracle when it stood before him on 4 legs, bearing the wounds of its own resurrection. Perhaps, Father McKenna said carefully, we should allow Rex to say goodbye. The words hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach, a recognition that went deeper than surprise or grief, because Phil's final words, spoken to her just 3 days ago from his hospital bed, had been about Rex, about how he could still hear the dog calling to him in his dreams, about how he'd give anything to see him one more time. He's waiting for me, Sarah, Phil had whispered, his fingers clutching the bloodied collar. Rex is waiting, and I can't keep him waiting much longer. She'd thought it was the morphine talking, or grief, or the way terminal cancer ate at a man's mind along with his body. She'd thought it was anything except what it apparently was. The truth? Rex moved again, closing the distance to the casket with measured steps. His paws made no sound on the grass, but Sarah could hear the soft wheeze of his breathing, could see the slight limp in his left hind leg. When he reached the flag-draped casket, he stopped and sat, his posture perfect, despite the scars. Textbook. Attention position, the way Phil had trained him years ago. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the rustle of dress uniforms as 200 cops held their collective breath. Sarah found herself studying Rex's face, looking for answers in the amber depths of his eyes. What she saw there made her stomach lurch. Recognition, intelligence, and something else, something that looked almost like anger, because Rex wasn't just here to say goodbye. The tension in his shoulders, the way his ears swiveled at every small sound, the careful way he positioned himself between the casket and the gathered mourners, these weren't the actions of a grieving dog. These were the actions of a canine still on duty, still protecting his partner, still working a case. 7 years earlier. The first time Sarah Chen saw Phil Robertson, he was arguing with a German Shepherd puppy about the proper way to heal. The puppy, barely 3 months old and all ears and oversized paws, seemed convinced that heal meant explore everything within a 50-foot radius as quickly as possible. Phil, his hair more brown than the silver it would become, crouched down to the puppy's level with the patience of a man who understood that some partnerships took time to develop. "Come on, Rex," Phil murmured, his voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that made Sarah pause in the doorway of the canine training facility. "Work with me here, buddy. We're a team, remember?" Rex, because even then, at 3 months old, he'd carried the name like a crown, tilted his head and promptly sat on Phil's foot, not beside it, on it, as if to say, "I understand the concept of partnership, human, but I'm going to interpret it my way." Phil had laughed then, really laughed, and Sarah had seen something in that moment that would take her years to fully understand. Phil Robertson didn't just train police dogs. He spoke their language. He thought their thoughts. He became their pack leader not through dominance, but through the kind of mutual respect that transcended species. Sarah had been fresh out of the academy then, assigned to patrol while waiting for a detective slot to open up. She'd volunteered for extra canine training, partly because it looked good on her record, and partly because she'd grown up with dogs and missed the uncomplicated loyalty they offered. What she hadn't expected was to witness the birth of a legend, because that's what Phil and Rex became. In 7 years of partnership, they'd racked up more successful drug busts than any canine team in the department's history. Rex could detect narcotics with an accuracy that bordered on supernatural. He'd once alerted on a car that turned out to have a single marijuana seed hidden in the air vent. Phil had the case clearance rate to match, built on the foundation of trust he'd established with a stubborn puppy who'd refused to heal properly. 3 years earlier, Sarah remembered the night Phil had first talked about retirement. They'd been working a stakeout, watching a suspected drug house while Rex dozed in the back of Phil's cruiser. It was one of those endless summer nights when the air was thick enough to swim through and the radio chatter became a hypnotic background hum. "You ever think about what comes next?" Phil had asked, his eyes never leaving the house across the street. "After all this? After what?" Sarah had been reviewing case files by the dome light, her own attention split between the surveillance and the mountain of paperwork that seemed to follow every detective like a shadow. After the badge, after the gun, after... Phil gestured toward the back seat, where Rex was snoring softly, his legs twitching in whatever dream dogs had about work and loyalty and the humans who earned their devotion. After all of it, Sarah had looked at Phil, then really looked at him. He was 52, old enough to have seen everything the streets could throw at a cop, but young enough to still believe he could make a difference. His hair was going silver, at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when she'd first watched him train a stubborn puppy. But his hands were steady on the steering wheel, and when Rex shifted in his sleep, Phil's attention immediately shifted to the sound. "I think about a cabin," Phil had continued, his voice soft enough not to wake his partner. "Somewhere up north, maybe. Lake Michigan, where Rex could swim and chase sticks and never have to worry about bullets or drug dealers or—" He'd stopped himself, but Sarah had heard the words he hadn't said. "Or dying for me." "He loves the work," Sarah had pointed out. "Look at him. Even asleep, he's listening for your voice." And it was true. Rex's ear had flicked toward Phil's voice even in sleep, an automatic response honed by years of partnership. "That's the problem," Phil had admitted. "He loves it too much. He'd work himself to death if I let him. Hell, he'd die for me without a second thought." 18 months ago, the warehouse district always felt like the edge of the world to Sarah. All empty lots and broken windows, and the kind of silence that made you check your weapon twice. She'd been back up on dozens of drug busts, but something about that night felt different. Maybe it was the way Rex had hesitated at the warehouse door, his usual eager energy replaced by something more cautious. Maybe it was how Phil had stopped, to adjust his partner's tactical vest, fingers lingering on the straps like he was saying a prayer. "Intel says they're armed but not expecting company," Phil had radioed. "Rex and I are going in through the front. Sarah, you take the rear exit in 60 seconds. Standard protocol. Sarah had done it 100 times, but as she'd watched Phil and Rex disappear into the darkness of the warehouse, her chest had tightened with the kind of dread that came before the phone call that changed everything. The shots had come 30 seconds later, 4 sharp cracks that echoed off the empty buildings like the sound of the world breaking. Sarah had abandoned protocol and run, her heart hammering against her ribs, her weapon drawn and ready. She'd found them in the center of the warehouse, surrounded by scattered crates and the kind of emptiness that told the real story. No drugs, no dealers, just Phil on his knees beside Rex, pressing his hands against wounds that were too deep and too many. The German shepherd's breathing was shallow, his eyes already growing glassy, but his tail wagged weakly when he saw Sarah approach. "They knew we were coming," Phil had said, his voice hollow. "They knew, and they used Rex as bait. Shot him first, then ran." Sarah had dropped beside them, pulling out her radio to call for an ambulance, a veterinarian, anyone who could stop the blood that was spreading too fast across the concrete floor. But Rex had looked at her then with eyes that were still intelligent, still aware, and she'd known it was too late. "He's trying to tell me something," Phil had whispered, leaning down until his forehead touched Rex's. "He's trying to warn me about something. But if Rex had a warning, he'd taken it with him to whatever place good dogs went when their work was finally done." 3 days ago, Phil's hospital room smelled like disinfectant and the kind of despair that accumulated in places where people went to die. Sarah had visited every day since the cancer diagnosis, watching her mentor grow smaller and more fragile, while his spirit remained as stubborn as the puppy who'd once sat on his foot. "I can hear him," Phil had told her, his fingers working the bloodied collar that never left his hands. "Rex, I can hear him calling to me." "Phil, I know how it sounds. But Sarah, I can hear him. He's trying to tell me something important. Something about that night." Phil's eyes, still sharp despite the morphine, had fixed on hers with desperate intensity. "Promise me something. Anything. When I'm gone, if anything strange happens, anything that doesn't make sense, you look into it. You look into that warehouse, that tip, everything. Because Rex died trying to protect me from something, and I think—" Phil's voice had faded as the medication pulled him under, but his grip on the collar had tightened. Sarah had made the promise, thinking it was the fevered wish of a dying man who'd never forgiven himself for his partner's death. She'd thought about grief and guilt, and the way terminal illness could make the impossible seem real. She'd never thought about resurrection. But here was Rex, alive and scarred and sitting, at attention beside Phil's casket like he'd never left. Here was Rex, 18 months after dying in Sarah's arms, positioned like a guard dog protecting his partner from threats only he could perceive. Here was Rex, and suddenly Phil's final words didn't sound like the ravings of a dying man. They sounded like a warning. The viewing began 3 hours after the cemetery incident, and Rex never left Sarah's side. Not by choice. Captain Martinez had made it clear that the dog was now her responsibility, until they figured out what the hell was going on. But Sarah sensed something deeper in the way Rex positioned himself. He didn't just follow her. He shadowed her, matching her pace so precisely that their footsteps sounded like one person walking. The funeral home's parking lot filled with police cruisers and civilian cars, but Rex's attention kept drifting to a black sedan parked across the street. Sarah noticed him stiffen each time someone approached from that direction, his hackles rising just enough to create a ridge of tension along his shoulders. When she tried to follow his gaze, the sedan was empty, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. "He's different than I remembered," said Officer Janet Morrison, crouching down to offer Rex her hand. She'd worked with Phil and Rex on several drug cases over the years, knew the dog's usual friendly demeanor. "He used to love attention. Now he won't even look at me." Sarah watched Rex politely ignore Janet's outstretched fingers, his focus remaining fixed on the funeral home's entrance. Every person who walked through those doors got the same treatment, a quick visual assessment, categorization as threat or non-threat, then dismissal. It was the behavior of a working dog, not a grieving pet. "Maybe he doesn't remember," Janet started. "He remembers," Sarah cut her off, because Rex had just done something that made her blood run cold. A man in an expensive suit had emerged from the sedan across the street, and Rex's entire body had gone rigid. Not aggressive, but alert in the way that preceded action. The way he used to look right before alerting on hidden drugs. The man was tall, mid-50s, with the kind of silver hair that cost money to maintain. He walked toward the funeral home with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being welcomed wherever he went. Sarah didn't recognize him, but Rex clearly did. The dog's breathing had changed, becoming shallow and controlled, and a low rumble started deep in his chest. "Easy," Sarah murmured, resting her hand on Rex's head. His fur was coarser than she remembered, crossed with scars that told stories she didn't know. "What is it, boy? What do you see?" Rex's response was to position himself directly between Sarah and the approaching man, his body language screaming protection. Not the playful protectiveness of a pet, but the calculated positioning of a canine who'd identified a genuine threat. The man reached the funeral home entrance and paused, his eyes sweeping the crowd before settling on Sarah and Rex. For just a moment, his confident expression flickered with something that looked like recognition or surprise. Then he smiled, a politician's smile, all teeth and calculation, and disappeared inside. "Who was that?" Sarah asked Janet, but the other officer was already walking away, her attention captured by a colleague's story about Phil's legendary arrest record. Rex's rumble deepened. Inside the funeral home, the viewing room was arranged like a stage set, all soft lighting and careful angles designed to make death look peaceful. Phil lay in his dress uniform, his hands folded over his chest, the bloodied collar finally removed from his fingers and placed beside a framed photo of him and Rex from their early days together. In the photo, they were both younger, Rex barely 2 years old and still growing into his ears, Phil's hair dark and his smile unguarded. Sarah found herself studying that photo while Rex explored the room with the methodical precision of a crime scene investigation. He checked every corner, every flower arrangement, every shadow that might conceal a threat. People tried to approach him, old friends of Phil's, fellow officers who'd worked with the legendary team, but Rex remained focused on his self-appointed mission. "Strangest thing I've ever seen," Captain Martinez muttered, joining Sarah by the photo. "Dog's been dead for 18 months, then shows up at the exact moment we're putting Phil in the ground. You believe in ghosts, Chen?" "I believe in evidence," Sarah replied, watching Rex pause beside the elaborate flower arrangement near the casket. The dog's nose twitched, processing scents with an intensity that made her think of drug detection. "And Rex isn't acting like a grieving pet, he's acting like he's working. Working what? Phil's dead. The case that got Rex killed was closed as a robbery gone wrong. Was it? Sarah kept her voice low, but Rex's ears swiveled toward the conversation anyway. Phil always thought there was more to it. Said the timing was too convenient, the tip too specific. Martinez's expression darkened. Phil was grieving. People see conspiracies when they're looking for someone to blame. But Rex had stopped moving. His attention locked on something behind Sarah. She turned to see the silver-haired man from the parking lot approaching, his expensive suit immaculate, despite the October chill. Up close, she could see he was older than she'd first thought, maybe 60, with the kind of manicured appearance that spoke of money and influence. Detective Chen. His voice carried the smooth authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I'm David Kellerman, City Council. I wanted to express my condolences for Detective Robertson's passing. He was a valuable member of our community. Sarah shook the offered hand, noting how Rex had positioned himself to keep both Kellerman and the room's exit in his field of vision. Thank you. Did you know Phil personally? We'd met at various civic functions. His work with the K9 unit was particularly impressive. Kellerman's eyes drifted to Rex, and something cold flickered in their depths. I was sorry to hear about his partner's death as well. Tragic loss. Rex's rumble returned, low enough that only Sarah could hear it. Actually, Kellerman continued, his smile never wavering, I was quite surprised to hear that his dog had recovered. The reports I read suggested the injuries were fatal. There it was, the slip that made Sarah's detective instincts come alive, because David Kellerman, city council member, had no business reading police reports about a K9's death. Those files were internal, restricted to department personnel and immediate family. Unless... What reports? Sarah asked, her voice carefully neutral. Kellerman's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. General briefings, community safety updates. You understand how these things filter up through the bureaucracy. Rex understood something too, because he stepped forward, placing himself directly between Sarah and Kellerman. It wasn't aggressive. Rex was too well trained for that, but it was unmistakable. The dog didn't trust this man. More than that, he feared him. Well, Kellerman said, his tone still pleasant but cooler now, I should pay my respects to Detective Robertson. Good evening, Detective Chen. He moved toward the casket, but Sarah caught him glancing back twice, his attention split between Phil's body and Rex's unwavering stare. Other mourners gave him respectful space, the deference that came automatically when dealing with city officials, but Rex tracked his every movement like a predator watching prey. 2 hours later, the viewing had ended, but Sarah found herself reluctant to leave. Rex seemed to share her hesitation, settling beside Phil's casket with the patient stillness of a sentry. The funeral home staff was cleaning up around them, removing flower arrangements and folding chairs with the quiet efficiency of people who dealt with death professionally. You can't stay here all night, Janet Morrison said softly, approaching. With Rex's old leash, the one Phil had carried in his patrol car for 7 years. He needs to eat, rest, figure out what comes next. Sarah clipped the leash to Rex's collar, surprised when he didn't resist. But as they walked toward the exit, the dog's attention kept returning to the room they were leaving, as if he was reluctant to abandon his post. In the parking lot, the black sedan was gone, but Rex still checked every shadow before allowing Sarah to open her car door. His hypervigilance was exhausting to watch, the constant assessment of threats that might or might not exist. What happened to you, boy? Sarah murmured, as Rex settled into her back seat. Where have you been for 18 months? And why did you come back now? Rex's answer was to rest his chin on the back of her seat, his breath warm against her neck. For the first time since the cemetery, he seemed to relax slightly, the rigid tension in his shoulders easing just enough to remind Sarah that beneath the scarred warrior was still the loyal partner who'd loved Phil Robertson enough to die for him. Her apartment was a 15-minute drive through streets that grew quieter as the city settled into evening routine. Rex watched everything, other cars, pedestrians, the play of streetlights through the windows. Sarah found herself checking her rearview mirror more than usual, though she couldn't say exactly what she was looking for. Sarah's apartment, Rex explored her small apartment with the same methodical precision he'd shown at the funeral home, checking Every room, every corner, every potential hiding place. Sarah watched from the kitchen as he investigated her bedroom, bathroom, even the coat closet, his nose working constantly to build a scent map of this new territory. When he finished his inspection, he returned to the living room and sat facing the front door, ears alert for any sound from the hallway beyond. It was the position Phil had trained him to take when guarding a location. Total awareness, ready response, infinite patience. "You're safe here," Sarah told him, settling onto the couch with a cup of coffee and the case file she'd pulled from Phil's desk. "Whatever you're watching for, it can't reach you here." But Rex didn't relax. If anything, his attention intensified as Sarah opened the file and began reading. The warehouse shooting had been classified as a robbery gone wrong. Drug dealers who'd fled when they realized the police were onto them, using lethal force to cover their escape. The investigation had been thorough, but brief, hampered by a lack of physical evidence and witnesses. What struck Sarah as she read was how clean it all seemed. Too clean. No fingerprints, no surveillance footage, no trace evidence beyond the blood that belonged to Rex. Even the anonymous tip that had led Phil and Rex to the warehouse had come through an untraceable burner phone. Rex whined softly, the first vocal sound he'd made since the cemetery. Sarah looked up to find him staring at the case file with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Because Rex recognized something in those pages, something that connected the past to the present, the dead partner to the living one, the warehouse to the cemetery, to David Kellerman's expensive suit and knowing smile. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. "Unknown number. We need to talk. Tomorrow noon, Riverside Park. Come alone. Trust no one else." A friend Rex's rumble filled the quiet apartment, and Sarah realized that whatever had brought him back from the dead wasn't finished yet. The case that had killed him once was still active, still dangerous, still hunting, and now it had her scent too. The next morning, Sarah woke to find Rex exactly where she'd left him, facing the front door, alert and unmoving, like he'd spent the entire night standing guard. The coffee cup she'd left on the table was cold, the case file still open to the crime scene photos that had made Rex whine the night before. But something was different. The apartment felt watched. "Morning, boy," she whispered, and Rex's tail moved once, a brief acknowledgement that didn't break his focus on the door. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from Captain Martinez, all logged between 2 and 4 a.m. Sarah's stomach tightened as she dialed him back. "Chen, where the hell are you?" Martinez's voice was rough with exhaustion and something else, fear. "We've got a situation." "What kind of situation?" "The kind where David Kellerman called the mayor at midnight claiming a rogue police dog threatened him at Robertson's viewing. The kind where Internal Affairs wants Rex put down as a public safety risk. The kind where you need to get down here now and explain why a dead dog is causing me more headaches than half my living detectives." Sarah's eyes found Rex, who had turned at the sound of Kellerman's name, his lips pulling back just enough to show teeth. "Sir, Rex never threatened anyone. He was completely under control." "Tell that to Kellerman's lawyer. He's claiming emotional distress, says the dog was aggressive and unpredictable. Wants the department held liable for allowing a dangerous animal near civilians." The pieces clicked together in Sarah's mind with crystalline clarity. Kellerman wasn't just trying to have Rex destroyed. He was trying to discredit any future testimony about the dog's behavior. If Rex was labeled dangerous and unstable, anything he might reveal about that night in the warehouse would be dismissed as the actions of a traumatized animal. "Captain, I need 12 hours. There's something about the warehouse shooting that doesn't add up, and Rex is a dog, Chen. A supposedly dead dog who's causing very living problems for this department. You've got 2 hours to bring him in for psychological evaluation, or I'll send a team to collect him." The line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone, then at Rex, who had positioned himself between her and the door again. The message was clear. He wasn't going anywhere without a fight. Riverside Park, 11:45. Sarah had arrived early, choosing a bench with clear sight lines in all directions. Rex sat beside her, his attention split between the jogging paths and the playground where children's laughter mixed with their parents' casual conversations. It was the kind of normal, everyday scene that made the previous 24 hours feel like a fever dream, until she saw the woman approaching from the east path. Mid-40s, auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a jacket that couldn't quite hide the shoulder holster underneath. She moved with the controlled grace of someone accustomed to danger, her eyes constantly scanning for threats. Rex noticed her too, his posture shifting to alert but not defensive, recognition without alarm. "Detective Chen?" The woman stopped, 10 feet away, her hands visible and empty. "I'm Lisa Garrett. I worked with Phil and Rex on several joint operations. DEA." Sarah had heard the name. Garrett was known for deep cover work in drug trafficking cases, the kind of agent who disappeared for months at a time and emerged with intelligence that broke entire networks. But she'd never actually met the woman. And Rex's calm reaction suggested he had. "You sent the text," Sarah said. "I did. And I'm sorry for the cryptic approach, but after what happened yesterday at the viewing, I figured you might need some context." Garrett glanced around the park, then settled onto the bench, keeping space between herself and Sarah. "Rex's resurrection isn't as miraculous as it seems. I've been taking care of him for the past 18 months. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "He's been alive this whole time. Phil died thinking." Phil couldn't know. Nobody could know, not until we understood what we were dealing with. Garrett's voice carried the weight of 18 months' worth of secrets. "That warehouse shooting wasn't random, Detective. It was an assassination attempt disguised as a robbery gone wrong. Rex wasn't just wounded. He was drugged, tranquilized first, then shot to make it look like he'd died protecting Phil." Sarah's mind raced through the implications. "But the veterinarian—" "Confirmed. The veterinarian was paid to falsify the death certificate. Rex was critical but alive when we extracted him from the scene. We had maybe 10 minutes to stage his death before the real coroners arrived." Rex whined softly, pressing closer to Sarah's leg. She could feel the tension in his body, the way his muscles coiled with barely contained energy. This wasn't a peaceful reunion, this was a briefing, a war council. "Who's we?" Sarah asked. "A joint task force that's been investigating corruption in the police department. Phil and Rex weren't just successful because they were good at their jobs. They were successful because they couldn't be bought. That made them dangerous to some very powerful people." Garrett pulled out a tablet, swiping to a series of surveillance photos. Sarah recognized several faces. David Kellerman, obviously, but also Deputy Chief William Santos, City Attorney Margaret Hill, and at least 3 other officials she'd seen at police functions over the years. They've been using police resources to protect their drug trafficking operation for the better part of a decade, Garrett continued, feeding information to dealers, manipulating evidence, ensuring that the right arrests never happen. Phil and Rex were getting too close to something big, so they tried to kill them both. They succeeded with Phil, just took 18 months to do it. The stress from losing Rex, the guilt over that night, it ate at him. The cancer was real, but the despair that let it win, that was manufactured. Sarah felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. Phil had died believing he'd failed his partner, carrying the weight of Rex's death like a stone around his heart. The cruelest part wasn't that they'd tried to kill him, it was that they'd made him kill himself with grief. "Why bring Rex back now?" she asked. "Because tomorrow morning the task force is moving on the entire network. We've got enough evidence to bring down everyone involved, but we needed one more piece of the puzzle." Garrett's eyes found Rex, who was staring at the tablet with an intensity that made Sarah's skin crawl. Rex was there that night. He saw who pulled the trigger, heard voices, processed scents. With the right handler, he could identify the shooter. "You want him to testify?" "I want him to help us find the smoking gun. There's a storage facility outside the city where they've been keeping evidence from compromised cases, drugs, money, weapons. Rex knows the scent signatures from that warehouse. If we can get him close enough to the storage facility, he might be able to lead us to proof that even the corruption can't cover up." It made sense. Too much sense. Sarah felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking together with the satisfying precision of a case finally breaking open. Rex's strange behavior, his hypervigilance, the way he'd reacted to Kellerman, it wasn't trauma or confusion. It was purpose. He'd been waiting 18 months for the chance to finish what he and Phil had started. "There's just one problem," Garrett said, her voice dropping. "Kellerman's move last night wasn't random. Someone told him Rex was back, someone in the department is feeding information to the network, and we don't know who." Sarah thought about Captain Martinez's early morning phone calls, his insistence that Rex be brought in for evaluation, about the way internal affairs had moved so quickly to label the dog dangerous, about how many people had access to information, about Rex's appearance at the funeral. "How do I know you're not the leak?" Sarah asked. Garrett smiled grimly. "Because if I were working for them, Rex would already be dead. They've had 18 months to eliminate the threat he represents. The only reason he's still alive is because they thought he was already gone." Rex stood. Suddenly, his attention focused on something beyond the playground. Sarah followed his gaze and saw a familiar figure approaching along the west path. Officer Janet Morrison, walking her own dog, a golden retriever that bounded happily at the end of its leash. "Shit," Garrett muttered. "We need to go. Now." "Janet's not involved in this. She's the one who called Kellerman last night." Garrett was already standing, her hand moving instinctively toward her weapon. "She's been feeding them information for months. Phil trusted her, which made her the perfect inside source." Sarah felt the world tilt sideways. Janet Morrison, who'd worked dozens of cases with Phil and Rex. Janet, who'd been at the warehouse that night, arriving just minutes after the shooting. Janet, who'd seemed genuinely surprised to see Rex at the funeral, but had asked all the right questions about his behavior. Janet, who was now less than 50 yards away and closing fast, her own hand resting casually on her service weapon. "Detective Chen?" Janet called out, her voice carrying across the park with forced cheerfulness. "What a coincidence. I was just walking Buster and saw you sitting here with Rex. How's our miracle dog doing today?" Rex's response was immediate and unmistakable. The rumble that started deep in his chest built to a low growl, and every muscle in his body went rigid with barely contained aggression. This wasn't the careful assessment he'd shown with Kellerman. This was recognition of immediate personal danger. "Easy, boy," Sarah said, but her own hand was moving toward her weapon now, muscle memory overriding confusion. "Oh," he remembers. "Me?" Janet said, and her smile was different now. Colder, the mask slipping just enough to show what lay beneath. "Dogs never forget, do they? Especially the scent of the person who shot them." The world crystallized into sharp focus around that single admission. Janet Morrison, 15-year veteran of the force, Phil's trusted colleague, had been the one to pull the trigger that night in the warehouse, had looked Rex in the eyes and shot him 3 times before turning her weapon on the partner who'd trusted her with his life. "You—" Sarah's voice caught in her throat, choked by rage and disbelief in equal measure. "Me," Janet confirmed, her weapon clearing its holster with practiced smoothness. And it should have stayed that way. Phil dead, Rex dead, case closed. But someone had to get clever with fake death certificates and secret task forces. Rex lunged. 70 pounds of German Shepherd muscle and 18 months of suppressed vengeance launched through the air like a missile, his trajectory aimed directly at Janet's throat. But Janet was ready, had been ready from the moment she'd spotted them across the park. Her shot caught Rex mid-leap, spinning him sideways to crash into the bench with a sound that made Sarah's heart stop. "No!" The word tore from Sarah's throat as she drew her own weapon, but Janet was already moving, using Buster's leash to tangle Sarah's legs as she tried to aim. The golden retriever yelped in confusion, his happy park day suddenly filled with violence and the scent of blood. Rex struggled to stand, his left hind leg dragging uselessly, but his eyes, God, his eyes were still fierce, still fixed on Janet with the kind of hatred that transcended species. He'd waited 18 months for this moment, had endured fake death and separation from his partner, had watched Phil die believing he'd failed. And now he was bleeding again, his second resurrection turning into another kind of death. "Stay down, hero," Janet snarled, her weapon tracking between Sarah and Rex. "You should have stayed buried." Garrett was moving now, circling wide to get a clean shot, but the playground was too close. Families with children were already running, screaming, cell phones out to record the chaos. A police shooting in broad daylight in front of witnesses. Even the corruption had its limits. "Why?" Sarah managed, her own gun finally clear, but with no shot she could take safely. "Phil trusted you. We all trusted you. Phil was going to destroy everything." Janet's voice carried the bitter edge of someone who'd convinced herself that betrayal was a virtue. 20 years I've been feeding information to the network. 20 years of supplementing my pension with money that nobody missed. Phil and his wonder dog were going to unravel it all for what? Justice? Duty? Fairy tale concepts that don't pay for college tuition or medical bills. Rex made another attempt to reach Janet, dragging himself forward on 3 legs, his blood leaving a dark trail on the concrete. The sight of his struggle hit Sarah like a physical blow, because she could see Phil in every painful inch of progress. The same stubborn determination, the same refusal to quit even when the odds were impossible. "He loved you," Sarah said, "and he—" She wasn't sure if she meant Phil or Rex. "You were part of his pack. Phil was a fool who lived in black and white." Janet adjusted her aim, the barrel of her gun centering on Rex's head. "And Rex is a loose end that should have been tied off 18 months ago. The shot came from an unexpected direction, not Janet's weapon, or Sarah's, or even Garrett's, but from the tree line beyond the playground. The bullet took Janet in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her weapon skittering across the pavement. She stumbled, cursed, pressed her hand to the wound as blood seeped between her fingers. "Federal agents, drop your weapons." The SWAT. Park filled with tactical teams seemingly materialized from thin air. FBI, DEA, U.S. Marshals, converging from every direction with the coordinated precision of a long-planned operation. Sarah lowered her gun, hands raised, but her attention remained fixed on Rex. The German shepherd had collapsed, his breathing shallow and labored. Sarah holstered her weapon and dropped to her knees beside him, her hands finding the new wound that leaked crimson across his scarred fur. His eyes found hers, still intelligent despite the pain, still trying to communicate something important. "I know, boy," she whispered, pressing her palm against the bleeding. "I know you did your job." Phil would be so proud. Garrett appeared beside them, her own weapon holstered, speaking rapidly into a radio. "We need a veterinary trauma team at Riverside Park immediately. Priority 1 medical emergency. Will he? Sarah couldn't finish the question. Couldn't voice the possibility that Rex might die again, this time for real. "He's stronger than he looks," Garrett said, but her voice carried doubt. "He survived worse in that warehouse." Sarah looked up to see Janet being loaded into an ambulance, her shoulder wound bandaged, her hands cuffed behind her back. Even wounded and defeated, she was talking, probably already negotiating for a plea deal, trading information for reduced sentences. The corruption would unravel now, one thread at a time, but the cost had been measured in blood and betrayal and the kind of trust that, once broken, could never be fully repaired. "The storage facility," Rex wheezed. No, that was impossible. Dogs didn't speak, but his eyes were so intent, so focused on Sarah's face, that she could almost hear Phil's voice echoing through his partner's desperate gaze. "Find the storage facility, Sarah." Garrett's hand touched her shoulder gently. "We have to let the medics work." The veterinary team was already setting up their equipment, preparing to transport Rex to the nearest animal hospital. But as they lifted him onto the stretcher, his head turned towards Sarah one last time. In his amber eyes, she saw something that made her chest tighten with recognition. This wasn't goodbye. This was a promise. Rex had survived fake death, and real. Bullets had endured 18 months of separation from everything he'd ever known, had returned from the grave to finish what he and Phil had started. He wasn't going to let a shoulder wound stop him now. But as the ambulance disappeared into traffic, Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Because Janet's betrayal was just the beginning. The storage facility Garrett had mentioned was still out there, still holding evidence that could expose the entire network. And if Rex was right, if he could lead them to the smoking gun, then the corruption would do anything to stop him, including making sure his third death was permanent. Emergency. Veterinary hospital. 6 p.m. 6 p.m. The waiting room smelled like disinfectant and fear, populated by worried pet owners clutching leashes and carriers. Sarah felt out of place among them, still wearing her tactical vest, her hands stained with Rex's blood. Garrett sat beside her, both of them waiting for news that seemed to take forever. "Surgery's complete," the veterinarian announced finally. Dr. Martinez, no relation to the captain, was a small woman with kind eyes and steady hands. The bullet missed the major organs, but there was significant muscle damage. "He'll need weeks of rehabilitation, maybe months." "But he'll live?" Sarah asked. "Physically, yes. Emotionally." Dr. Martinez hesitated. "This dog has been through severe trauma. Multiple gunshot wounds, extended separation from his handler, the stress of whatever he experienced during his missing months. He may never be the same." Sarah thought about Rex's eyes in the park, the intelligence and determination that had burned there despite his pain. "He's stronger than you think." "I hope you're right, because there's something else." Dr. Martinez pulled up a series of X-rays on her tablet. "These scars, the way they healed, this isn't the first time he's been shot. The bone density, the muscle development, the conditioning, this dog has been training, intensively, for months." Garrett and Sarah exchanged glances. Rex hadn't just been hiding for 18 months. He'd been preparing, healing, training, getting ready for the moment when he could return to finish his mission. "Can we see him?" Sarah asked, briefly. "He's heavily sedated, but dogs sometimes respond to familiar voices during recovery." Rex lay on his side in the intensive care unit, surrounded by monitors and IV lines. His breathing was steady but shallow. His eyes closed, his body finally still after 2 days of constant vigilance. Sarah approached slowly, afraid to disturb the equipment that was keeping him alive. "Hey, partner," she whispered, settling into the chair beside his kennel. "Phil would be so proud of you. You kept fighting just like he taught you." Rex's ear flicked toward her voice, a tiny movement that somehow carried the weight of recognition. His eyes opened slightly, unfocused but aware, finding her face in the dim light. "The storage facility," Sarah continued, keeping her voice low. "When you're better, when you're ready, we'll find it together. We'll finish what you and Phil started." Rex's tail moved once against the blanket, the faintest ghost of a wag. Then his eyes closed again, and he settled deeper into sleep, his body finally allowing itself to heal. But even unconscious, even drugged and wounded, Rex maintained the posture of a working dog. Ready, waiting. Prepared to answer the call when duty demanded sacrifice. Sarah stayed until visiting hours ended, her hand resting gently on Rex's head, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. Outside, the city continued its nightly routine, unaware that a legend was fighting for his life in a veterinary ICU, unaware that the case that had seemingly ended with Phil Robertson's death was about to crack wide open, unaware that sometimes the dead came back to finish what they'd started.